Welcome to Lord of the Rings the Musical, featuring such hit songs as
Where there's a wit, there's a way.
and featuring the epic vibrato talents of Glenn Yarbrough.
Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom.
In all seriousness, though, folks, we have a movie here that I grew up watching, and which is possibly, along with the Rankin Bass Hobbit, responsible for me becoming the person you see before you now. Because if it had not been for this movie and the Rankin Bass Hobbit, I might never become a huge Tolkien fan, and this channel might not exist. So it's definitely something that we need to consider, and I will say that despite its many flaws, it does certainly have a lot of advantages as well. And so I'm going to try to talk about all the various pros and cons of this movie and give you an idea of where it succeeds, where it fails, and whether it's worth owning for any of you who've never seen it before. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is Lord of the Rings the Musical. Now, the interesting thing about that is, of course, the fact that there is a lot of singing that happens in this movie, and it seems very out of place for something like The Return of the King, which is a fairly dark element in an already fairly dark story. But we should remember that Tolkien introduces a lot of poetry and song into the Lord of the Rings itself, and it's not all dreary. And another interesting thing about that here, the story in this movie is set in a frame. We're getting it as a flashback. Not really a flashback, actually. We're getting it as a story told for the purposes of informing Bilbo of why Frodo is missing a finger. Now, this is a little awkward because it doesn't fit the way the narrative actually goes, but it's done in a really interesting way, and specifically it's done by the means of a minstrel. There's a minstrel who sings this song to the audience who are all at Rivendell. And so within this context, oddly enough, the singing kind of fits, because you have to remember that's kind of how minstrels work. They sing stories. And this is also really interesting because it's reminiscent of a scene in the book that never makes it into any film adaptation of any of the Return of the King or anything. And that is, after the ring is destroyed, Frodo and Sam are brought to the field of Cormallen, which is in the area of Ithilien, and they are there given a lot of praise before they return to Minas Tirith by Aragorn and all this. And at the field of Cormallen, a minstrel does in fact sing the story of Frodo and the Nine Fingers. And this is kind of a throwback to something that Sam had already said in the story and all this. So, I mean, interestingly enough, the way they set off this movie is actually kind of a reference to that thing that we never actually see happen in the story, and weirdly enough kind of works as a setup. Now, the way it doesn't quite work is there's a lot of backstory that we miss out on. We don't get, enough backstory to understand really all that much about the ring. We know the ring is dangerous and whatnot, and we know it's got to be destroyed. We know Sauron is the big bad, but beyond that, the exposition on this is a little on the weak side. Now, the fact that it's a made-for-TV movie and they don't have that much time to go into stuff, and the fact that the Ralph Bakshi film didn't exactly bring us up to the point where the Return of the King could really kick off is partially the reason for that, because you could watch the Ralph Bakshi film and then watch The Return of the King by Rankin Bass, and you'd still be missing a fairly decent chunk. So there's not a whole lot there, and if you hadn't watched the Ralph Bakshi film, but only the Rankin Bass Hobbit, you'd know even less. So there's a lot of things that kind of get glossed over, like it's the early part of the story. It just says Frodo and Sam had a lot of adventures on their way. Well, that's one way to summarize, two whole volumes in the trilogy, I suppose. But that's kind of the way it's forced to work out, just because of the way the storytelling is handled. But for the most part, the storytelling is pretty good. And in fact, in some places, it's kind of advanced. In fact, it's weird because a lot of the singing kind of tones down some of the darker elements to in a way that kind of helps it be a little more kid friendly, which is kind of what Tolkien does in The Hobbit, because he kind of talks about really dark and nasty things, but does it in a slightly humorous way and manages to keep everything at that level, but also manages to not totally scare his audience. And in the same way, the Return of the King movie does sort of the same thing with all the singing, and so it makes it kid friendly, but some of the storytelling is such that unless you're significantly older and really have a grasp of what they're trying to do with some of the way they tell the story, or if you just already know the story from other sources, there's things that aren't going to make a whole lot of sense. That said, even as a kid, you can still enjoy this movie because there's enough there that you don't have to know all the backstory and it's not that important to you. But at any rate, that's one of the weird things about this that's kind of almost self-contradictory, is it's at the same time, it's really high level and yet really low level because it's aiming at a much younger audience. And one of the weird things about that too is some of the dialogue gets into some really advanced vocabulary, such as
consider no less than the cataclysmic transformation of that ancient world of wonder and magic to the world we know now of man.
So there's just, that's an example of Gandalf going off with highfalutin language that isn't even in the Return of the King itself or any of the Lord of the Rings, and yet it's, it's this really high vocabulary, and yet it seems like a kid's movie. So that's one of the weird things about this. Now let's look at some other more specific stuff. Okay, let's start off with some of the elements of this movie that are general, but don't necessarily affect the overall theme or scheme. So the music, for one. Maybe this is just me because I really like 70s music, but I enjoy the music in this movie. And of course, it probably doesn't hurt that I grew up watching it a lot and therefore enjoy it to this day because I just grew up enjoying it. That said, I do think that the music fits the movie pretty well for the most part and does a good job of conveying whatever is trying to be conveyed at the time. Another thing that's kind of a general trend in the movie, but is a very specific thing, is that the pronunciation, by and large, is rottenly bad. For example, you get references to Minas Tirith and Cirith Ungol and various other things that are just, I can't even count all the examples. There's just tons of them, and it's just really, really, really bad. But if you can get past the pronunciation, which in none of the animated movies based on Tolkien is the pronunciation very good, let's just face it. But if you can get past all that, you can at least enjoy the story. And of course, the problem is, having watched this early in my life, it ruined my pronunciation of a lot of things for a long time until I read the appendices of Lord of the Rings, and then I had to unlearn all of the bad things that I had learned. But let's take a look at some different stuff. So let's take a look at some specific scenes. There's the temptation of Sam, which oddly enough, given the fact that this is a much shorter movie than Peter Jackson's Return of the King, it's amazing that Peter Jackson left this out, but this movie puts it in. And I think it's really important that you do see this, because from Sam's point of view, we actually get the temptation of the ring much more direct than we do from Frodo. Frodo theoretically is the author of the tale for the most part, and yet it's really only Sam that we get as a first-person, view of what the temptation of the ring really looks like. And here's what it looks like.
The gardens of my delight. So shall I transform the
Now, here Sam is imagining that he is going to be, leading this army against Sauron, and that matches up with the book. And then it follows that with the idea of Sam turning Mordor into a garden, which is also in the book. And this is really interesting, and it's done pretty well, I think, in this movie, such that we really get an idea of this is the kind of thing that a character, holding the ring and really, really feeling its temptation would think in his own mind, and how tempting that would be to, just take the power and use it. And then at the end, we get this scene where Sam realizes that's a mistake.
What brought me back? Plain hobbit sense. I know in my heart I'm not enough to bear such a burden. One small garden of a free gardener is all my need and due. My own hands to use, not the hands of others to command.
And at the end of this scene, what we see, and again, this is also from the book. I mean, pretty much all of this stuff is straight from the book. All of this is left out of Peter Jackson's movie, and I think that's a shame, because this is really interesting to get this view of what the ring is like to the actual wearer. And it's also interesting to see how Sam responds to it, because he's really the only one that we see, not only the first person, but also see him just, reject what he sees. I mean, we see Frodo refusing to put the ring on a lot, but we never get that idea of what exactly he's being tempted by. What is it? Is it just the draw to put on the ring? Because we know that there's times where he basically feels compelled to put it on, but doesn't. But we don't really know whether he's seeing visions of what he might achieve if he put the ring on. So this is a really interesting thing. Another scene that I think is worth mentioning is the one and only time that we see what I assume has to be Faramir in this movie. And let me show you that. Did you catch that? He was there for like 2 seconds. Faramir is reduced to a cameo in this movie. In fairness, Denethor doesn't get much time in the movie either, and you can kind of see why. When you've got to really compress the narrative down for a short movie like this, you have to cut out a lot of stuff, and a lot of Denethor's time is spent talking with Gandalf and all these other things, and there's not much that has to do with the general narrative, other than, Denethor's impact on Gandalf not going off to fight the Witch King, which that is included in this movie, but it doesn't have anything to do with Faramir. Pippin just runs up and says, Denethor's gone crazy, and they go off. But, it's really interesting that Faramir is even given cameo space here when he's not at all a part of the narrative in any other way. So, kind of an odd choice. Speaking of Denethor, after Denethor gets himself killed, Gandalf is really despondent, and it seems that he is taking the words of Denethor about the Black Fleet coming up the river way too much to heart, and just completely despairing. And Pippin is the one that has to rouse him out of that. And it's a little weird, because Gandalf is always supposed to be the one that's not giving in to despair. So that it's weird how all of that plays out in this movie, and why is Gandalf the one that's totally despairing. But at any rate, that's just one that I wanted to bring up. Another scene worth mentioning is the File of Galadriel and the Watchers scene. This one is a little weird, because we have zero precedent for the File of Galadriel. I mean, even if you watch the Ralph Bakshi film, you don't really have any gift-giving in Lothlorien, so you've got no context for what this is, and so they have to pass it off as Frodo ends up explaining it to Sam as basically saying, if I tell you what it is and betray its secret, its powers will die. Okay. But the one thing that they did do that I thought was nice was they actually did the Watchers the right way. Again, unlike Peter Jackson's movie, where Sam just kind of sees these statues and then goes right through and there's no big deal. Here's how they do it in this movie.
Dreadful spirit of evil vigilance abode in them, and they were aware.
My imagination's running away with me. They're made of stone. What harm can they do? Oh, don't get too cocky, Samwise. Orcs aren't made of stone. They have ears. Though where the blazes are they? I thought the tower was full of them. Oh, but they give me the shivers. Oh, forget about them. Get past as quick as I can. Bless my soul. Like some invisible gate. Oh, that's how the Watchers keep guard, eh? Blast! How do I get through or climb over or under something I can't see? How? Ouch! Something's burning me. What's this? A file. And what magic is in it to make it glow so? They're opening up.
So that's really nice, the fact that they actually incorporated this part of the book, which is, for my money, one of the more scary parts of the book, because you're like, what in the world is in these statues that can do this, and what is going on? You know, you have to, when you let your brain actually go on the track of what could be the power that's blocking Sam. That's a kind of a scary thought. And so it's really interesting to bring that into the story, and yet Peter Jackson just skims over it because I don't know why he skims over it. But here they actually get into it, and I really like that. The other interesting thing I wanted to point out isn't so much a scene per se, but the way that they handle the chronology, the parallel chronologies, I should say, of Frodo's journey and the action in Minas Tirith. The way they do it, they play things off of each other as if the events are connected. And there is a sense in which that is true in the book, but the way they do it in this movie, they rush up Frodo's part of the narrative way too much, such that they reach Mount Doom roughly at the end of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. And so they have to work around this by saying that Sam, after Frodo puts the ring on in Mount Doom, Sam is looking for Frodo for days before he finally finds him. Now, this raises all kinds of problems. First of all, you know, given what we know about how this works, Sauron would have known he was there from the minute he put it on and would have sent the Nazgul there to take it, and that would have been the end of that. Also, Sam and Frodo were already starving. How are they going to survive in a sweltering volcano with no water for days? It doesn't make any sense. And so the way they handle that is like, whose idea was it to mess with the chronology that much? It just doesn't really make any sense. So, overall thoughts, this movie has, again, for my musical taste, pretty good music, and I think the music does work pretty well for the most part, although there are a couple of times where it seems just maybe a little out of place. The acting is pretty good. I mean, you've got Roddy McDowall as Samwise, which is an interesting choice, and it works, I think, pretty well. Samwise is not quite the country bumpkin simpleton that you might expect him to be. Certainly, he's a lot smarter than the Ralph Bakshi version, but also he's maybe a little bit too intelligent for the Samwise that we know and love from the books. And there's, a lot of the same people come from the Rankin Bass Hobbit. You've got Orson Bean as Bilbo. You've got John Huston as Gandalf. But the acting is pretty good as far as it goes. We get very little of Aragorn. I forgot to mention that earlier. Aragorn is almost like a sideshow in this movie. He's mentioned as being important, but that's about all we get. The way they bring in Theoden and all that is also a little weird, but the overall, I think it works pretty well. Like I said, there's issues with the plot, getting the backstory and exposition. It's a little difficult, but it does in some ways fill you in on other plot points that it doesn't directly give you in songs or just in references. And if you're a careful watcher, you can pick up on those things. It's difficult sometimes, but that kind of goes back to what I was saying about this seems to be aimed at kids, but at the same time, it seems a little bit too high level for kids. It's a really weird mix. I mean, if you know the story already and you can make sense of everything, it works better in some ways. On the other hand, does a kid really need to know all the other stuff about it? Probably not. So, would you, as an adult, potentially, I don't know how many of my watchers are adults versus kids, but as an adult, if you've never seen this movie, is it worth you seeing it? Probably so. I would say that it's definitely worth a watch, if only because there are definitely things in this movie that are done in some ways much more faithfully to the book than in the Peter Jackson adaptation. And, you know, the Peter Jackson adaptation, I have my qualms with, and but I also think it's really good for the most part. But there's aspects of the way they do it here that I think Peter Jackson would have done well to incorporate, like the temptation of Sam by the ring. I mean, I think that is a almost crucial part of the story that was just criminally left out of Peter Jackson's movies. I just don't understand why they didn't do that. So beyond that, perhaps the major pros and cons would be, if you can get past the music, because some of it does seem a little silly as an adult, I suppose. Where there's a whip, there's a way, guys. If you can get past the music and the bad pronunciation and the really short shrift given to backstory and exposition, you'll find that it is actually a fairly serious movie with, considering the amount of time they have to work with, a good amount of the story fit in. And they fit it in reasonably well. Is it going to replace reading the book or watching Peter Jackson's version, which has much more of the story? No, certainly not. But especially if you do like The Hobbit, which I still need to do a video on that one, the Rankin Bass Hobbit, then this is a really good follow-up to it. It works in a lot of the same ways. It does a lot of the same types of things, and it's really enjoyable. And much as the music may seem a little weird and out of place, I still find myself humming some of these tunes, and maybe they'll become earworms for you too. So, leave that open as a possibility. At any rate, I would definitely say that if you love Tolkien and you're just interested in adaptations, pick this one up, if only for curiosity's sake and to get some different takes on things than you would get from anyone else. So, that is my review of the Rankin Bass Return of the King movie, also known as Lord of the Rings, the musical. So, rather humorously by me, anyway. Be that as it may, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it around. If you want to follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, you can occasionally get some Tolkien trivia-related questions there. And you can also, of course, subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.